This is Religious Studies 3300, Martin Luther King Jr., the Rhetoric and Theology of Nonviolent Social Change at Tennessee Tech University for the spring 22 semester. I'm the instructor, Mr. Smith, from Cookeville via Detroit, Michigan, and many other places across this crazy United States. The first slide I've pulled up has got a picture of Dr. King speaking before many microphones with a very engaged and passionate look on his face. And the quote, "I am sorry you don't know me." And this is a quote from his very famous Beyond Vietnam speech, which was given in the spring of 1967. And this is very, very important because of the national holiday, because of the statue in Washington, because of his larger than life persona, one of the most famous Americans, the only non-political American to be sort of memorialized the way that he has been with statues and a national holiday and the like. Dr. King, the most famous Black American of all time, and really a unique person, a Baptist preacher, not a general or a president, to be held to the stature that he is in our country is due to his greatness. But he was an incredibly controversial figure in his time. He was incredibly unpopular at the time of his assassination. He was hated by many white Americans, and he was distrusted or misunderstood by many Black Americans. And when he came out against the Vietnam War, which history has shown us was a terrifyingly tragic and problematic war, he said in that speech, "I am sorry you don't know me." And so my hope and my goal this semester is to teach you the real Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and to rely on the historical record, to rely on the words that he said and the things that he did, and expert scholars, more expert than me, that have studied Dr. King's legacy and lineage carefully, to show you the true Dr. King, who is a radical and dangerous American, but he's also one motivated by the principles of love that he learned from Jesus and Mahatma Gandhi. So he's a passionate and complicated character. But I hope to teach you all the real Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., not the postage stamp, not the, Monday, January 17th, 50% off sale at the local mall, Dr. King, but the real Dr. King. And so this meme that I'm now showing on the screen, that this meme will not be you. I have a dream that one day people who oppose almost everything I stand for will take a few words from this speech out of context and make it sound like I'm one of them, while ignoring absolutely everything I ever said, as well as the words of everyone following my example at that time. It's okay if you disagree with Dr. King on some of the issues that we come up with, but what the temptation has been historically, both with this class and with everyone in the United States, is rather than acknowledge where they disagree with Dr. King, to try to shape Dr. King into their own image. Well, of course, I believe in the Second Amendment, so Dr. King would have believed in the Second Amendment. Well, there's a very interesting story about guns and Dr. King that we'll get to next week when we discuss the Montgomery bus boycott. And like that, there are very many myths and controversies surrounding Dr. King. People have said he was a Republican. That's another myth surrounding Dr. King. Well, actually, King was neither a Democrat nor a Republican, but we will get to the heart of who he truly was in this course. Our journey officially, and I'll go before 1955, but really we're going to bracket the movement that he was the national leader for, and that begins when he becomes the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association as a young preacher at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and the time when Rosa Parks stood up by sitting down. And we're going to go from the beginning of that movement, which officially began on December the 1st, 1955, until he was taken out by an assassin's bullet on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, on April the 4th in the early evening, around right before dinner time. He was on his way to dinner when he was murdered in Memphis. And that will be the bracket of our time together this semester. And as the way the year spins, and I've always taught this class only in the spring semester because it almost has like a church calendar, almost like a liturgy to it. So we begin around Dr. King's birthday, and King Moss, if you will. We begin with Dr. King's birthday, which is this Saturday. He would have been 93 years old. We begin with his birthday, and we will in the spring, in April, we will remember his murder. And because of his faith in his religion, and because of his legacy, he's resurrected in each and every one of us as people who could, if we would be willing, to carry that dream forward. And it's a tall task. I don't recommend it necessarily to everyone, but that could be something that you take away from this class, is that you will be an ambassador for the dream. I learned, as it's said on the slide, here, that's important as a white American to remember my role, and that sometimes white Americans need to take a seat when it comes to conversations about Dr. King. And the good news for you all, and we have Black students and white students in this class, is that every one of you is going to be an expert on Dr. King at the end of the semester, so you will be allowed to talk about Dr. King. You'll be able to hold your own in a conversation about Dr. King. And when you hear people perpetuating lies and myths about Reverend King, you'll be able to correct them, because you will have studied him at an upper division academic level at a credentialed university from a professor who has spent his entire life trying to learn more about this man and live up to this man's teachings. And my mentor at Vanderbilt, Dr. Lewis Baldwin, Dr. Karsten, who I mentioned before, my dad who marched with Martin in the 60s, and my role as a youth in starting the King holiday in Detroit. So I've paid my dues for this, you'll have a credential, you'll have a certificate in Dr. King to where you're qualified to talk about it by completing this class. So I just am so honored to have heard your introductions a little bit earlier, and I just want to again formally welcome you to Martin Luther King Jr., the Rhetoric and Theology of Nonviolent Social Change here for the spring semester of 2022 at Tennessee Tech in Cookeville. So some of the core things that influenced him, and I draw here, and if you've already bought your book, you could grab it, but I'll refer to some sections here in this first part of the lecture to our textbook, The Autobiography of Dr. King. But let me give my academic framework and how they apply to the subject matter at hand. I'm trained in literature and writing, and therefore I'm trained in the art of rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of making a good argument. And Dr. King, as an orator, as a sermon maker and speech maker, and author of books, is a profoundly talented rhetorician. So King knows how to use language for the art of persuasion. So one of our foci and one of your papers will be about analyzing one of his documents, one of his speeches, for its art of persuasion. So rhetoric is one of our framing devices as scholars here this semester. And the other framing device is theology. And theology is the study of God. And so we are going to study Dr. King as a Baptist preacher who loved Jesus and tried to follow the teachings of Jesus, who was also very interested in world religions and understood the Greek philosophers and understood the great work of a Hindu teacher from India called Gandhi. And so we're going to study the role that God played and the role that religion played in making him the leader that he was. One thing about rhetoric is in his speeches, you will notice certain strategies that he uses, such as repetition. Repetition of particular phrases and the use of alliteration, the use of an anchor phrase, the use of a refrain or of a chorus. Yes, already on the chat, we're having a question. We're going to be writing 3 major papers. And rather than going all over those right now in the middle of this lecture, I'll reassure you that you will have a detailed assignment sheet for each one of those papers and a specific due date. And I'll go over paper 1 either at the end of today or at the beginning of next week, since you all want to know. But I'll also give that to you in writing as well. So you'll have a detailed bullet by bullet description of how to do your papers. You won't be expected to just kind of fly those blind. Okay. So I have a dream would be an anchor phrase. I've been to the mountaintop would be an anchor phrase. And so how long, not long would be an anchor phrase. And so he'll have these moments in his oratory where he will use rhetoric so carefully and so artfully, and he will amplify his use of language in such a way that it pulls the listener in. His understanding of God, as we'll learn here in a minute, was not entirely conventional. He is not a fundamentalist Christian. You maybe have heard this phrase growing up here in the Bible Belt. We are in the heart of the Bible Belt here in Tennessee. But Dr. King, while a Christian and while a Baptist, was not a fundamentalist Christian. He would be what you would call a liberal Christian. And we don't use that phrase today the way it was used in his time. And I'll explain that in quite some depth in tonight's lecture, because it's really foundational to understanding who King is. And also it's just really foundational to this class. So one of King's major lifelong goals was the inauguration of what he called the beloved community. The beloved community. And he got this idea from a teacher by the name of Josiah Royce, but it's King that popularized this notion of the beloved community. And I'm taking my definition of the beloved community here directly from the King Center website, from kingcenter.org. The beloved community, and this, I've known a lot of church people. I, by the way, have just recently retired from a very brief time as a congregational pastor in the Presbyterian Church USA denomination. I was commissioned to be a preacher down in Sparta, Tennessee for about 3.5 years. And it was actually after the murder of George Floyd when I realized that my congregation and I didn't see eye to eye on what God was doing in the civil rights movement of Black Lives Matter, that I had to retire from being a preacher. And I'm not currently active in a Christian denomination anymore, but I do love Jesus, right? So here's the thing, class. When I was coming up through my parents, I was coming up through a lineage of Christianity that would be called mainline liberal or progressive Christianity. And in that upbringing that I had in the faith, this phrase, the beloved community, was synonymous with what Jesus called the reign of God or the kingdom of God. And in the Gospels, Christ talks about he comes to inaugurate or to create a new way of doing things. And Kingian scholars and Kingian style preachers and activists, we call this the beloved community. So the beloved community is our ultimate goal here on earth, is to live this way. And so look at what the King Center says about it. It is a global vision. That means it's for everybody, in which all people share in the wealth of the earth. Economic inequality and extreme poverty and extreme wealth would not exist in a beloved community. An end to all poverty, hunger, and homelessness. An end to racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice. And Dr. King wasn't a big feminist, and Dr. King had a colleague, Bayard Rustin, who was homosexual, and King didn't really tarry in that. But his wife, Coretta, after he died, she made it very, very clear that she thinks the long arc of King's message would be very affirming of all forms of diversity, including LGBT diversity and gender diversity between men and women. The beloved community is all inclusive. It is a sibling relationship, sisters and brothers, and all people who don't identify with those gendered terms. A beloved community is a place of peace where international disputes will be resolved by peaceful conflict resolution and reconciliation. The ultimate goal of the beloved community is reconciliation. That's turning enemies into friends. So that's turning your auntie who's a hardcore Biden supporter who wore one of those pink hats and marched at the Women's March, and your crazy uncle who's got 10 Trump flags in the yard, and reconciliation of enemies. King was serious about that. And he was serious when he said he loved the cops as they were beating the crap out of protesters. We don't talk like that so much recently, but King was extremely sincere about his ethic of nonviolence. And I'm going to pivot immediately from teaching on the beloved community to teaching of the ethic of nonviolence. And so the other high regarded tenets of beloved community are love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred, and peace with justice will prevail over war and military conflict. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred, and peace with justice will prevail over military conflict. Sorry for that long pause. I had invited somebody to sit in tonight, and I'd sent out a bunch of guest invitations, and nobody else came. But I had one friend that said they wanted to come, and I sent them a link just there. They might show up, they might not, and they might come on a future day as well. Okay, so peace with justice will prevail over war and military conflict. And so, in a social justice context, peace is not just the absence of violence and fighting. Peace is not submission to the status quo, no matter what. Peace is the active presence of justice. That means of equitable social relations between opposing groups and between unequal groups. It's working towards a conscious reparation of past wrong and the presence of fairness going forward. And so this is a very high ideal. And so a person would look at the beloved community and say, well, maybe this is some kind of a utopia. And that the irony is that it's precisely not. It's something important and big and crazy, but it's not perfect. And utopia implies some kind of a harmonic perfection, that that's just not going on with the beloved community. So now I'm going to introduce the core principles of nonviolent social change. When I used to go to protests back in the day, you were being constantly reminded of the nonviolence code of conduct. It wasn't even, it wasn't just assumed. Sometimes you were handed a leaflet. These are the nonviolent expectations of your participation today. Sometimes you were required to go to a class and do role-playing scenarios. We will look at Reverend James Lawson from the Nashville movement and some of the trainings that he used to do with the young people to make sure that they knew how to practice nonviolence. I was in the streets, as many were, a lot last summer in 2020, and I didn't see people talking. We did practice nonviolence, especially here in Cookeville. There were so many rumors going around, that Cookeville was going to have a riot and people were going to bring out their guns and shoot us and this kind of stuff. And hey, we didn't want to die, So we were very, very peaceful in the movement here in Cookeville. But we haven't seen, I think, a commitment to Kingian nonviolence in the last generation of movement that we used to have. And I think one of the reasons for this is people aren't sure that this works anymore. I think some people are really radically disillusioned with Kingian nonviolence. So I want you all to study these with me and be thinking about this. Is this something that we could do today? And is this something that you could believe in? Because King would talk a lot about it being a practical and tactical concern, but it comes with it has a moral claim to it, right? So he's not just kind of saying this for the sake of saying it. He really means it. Number one, nonviolence is a way for courageous people. It is active nonviolent to resistance to evil. So nonviolence is not cowardly, it's courageous. Nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. The end result of nonviolence is redemption and reconciliation. Nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. Nonviolence recognizes that evildoers are also victims. This is very hard for us. We like to think of, the other side being the bad guy. And depending on what side you're on, Biden and Fauci are the bad guys, or, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Trump are the bad, So we've gotten to these, silos and into these very entrenched adversarial positions. So this idea that our enemy is not inherently evil, but that maybe they've engaged in evil practices, and learning to separate the evil from the evildoer is a profoundly challenging and risky thing to do. And some people would argue highly unrealistic. Nonviolence holds that suffering can educate and transform. Nonviolence willingly accepts the consequences to its acts. So if you are in trouble, you go to jail willingly. You don't avoid the consequences of your actions. And the redemptive side of suffering. And this comes out definitely out of the Christian aspect of King's theology, but this is also available in Eastern philosophy like Buddhism, which says that all life is suffering. And some folks today, there's so much pain in the world. The idea that a person would willingly suffer for a greater good, this has fallen under some scrutiny. And I think some people do not see this as consistent with justice as they did at one time. So these principles are not without questioning. And when we get into studying Dr. King, you're going to find out that his adversaries in the movement days, they were crystal clear. They did not think that nonviolence was nonviolent. Did you follow what I'm saying, class? They thought his nonviolence was very violent. Okay, and we'll unpack that more later as it plays out. Nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. Nonviolence resists violence to the spirit as well as the body. Nonviolence love is active, not passive. Nonviolence love does not sink to the level of the hater. Love restores community and resists injustice. Nonviolence recognizes the fact that all life is interrelated. Nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. The nonviolent resistor has deep faith that justice will eventually win. So on this previous slide, this idea that everything is connected, I think there is evidence in science and religion and in reality that as we have come to experience it as humans, that this is true, that everything is connected. However, this idea that the universe is inherently good and on the side of justice, this is a tall ask. And coming at it from a theological perspective, some Christians, Dr. King would not be among these, but some Christians believe that the good of the divine is outside of the world and that the world is actually crap, that the world is actually evil, and that the good of God exists outside of the world. King believes that the world or the universe, that all that can be known is inherently good and of God. And that's a biblical idea too. Genesis chapter 1 supports this idea. But this idea of the fall and of sin, it's a very complicated, and it's complicated in King, as we will see shortly. All right, we're going to take a whirlwind tour to the formative events and people in King's life that made him into the thinker that he was. And keeping in mind that he graduated high school around 15 and got his PhD around 26. So unlike me, I got my bachelor's when I was 27 and I never got a PhD, So King was it was wildly intelligent and an overachiever. But the reading that he did from the time he got to Morehouse in Atlanta to when he graduated from Boston University with a PhD, while he defended his dissertation, he was already serving as the pastor at Dexter Avenue in Montgomery. We're gonna see the trajectory of these major influences. On page 18 in our textbook, he talks about learning from Walter Rauschenbusch and the social gospel. And the basic gist of the social gospel is this: thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So heaven on earth. The essential purpose of Christianity is to transform society into the kingdom of God. Walter Rauschenbusch on the social gospel is profoundly formative to King. He reads this book, he internalizes it, and he believes that the beloved community is King's interpretation of the beloved community is an update of what he read in Rauschenbusch. And Rauschenbusch was a passionate person who really believed and did all of these things and was born during the Civil War. So you can't say that he was doing this in a world where it was already perfect. The world in which Rauschenbusch was writing this was not a perfect world. He was born in the Civil War, and he died during World War I. Or at the end of World War I. So he wasn't. This is the thing when we talk about how idealistic these people are, because they're profoundly idealistic. they're not unrealistically so. Their idealism is tempered by living in the real world, and there was suffering and tragedy in the real world of their times as it is in ours. Probably the most famous influence on King in the United States in terms of the tactics that ended up becoming so effective during the nonviolent civil rights movement is Henry David Thoreau and his essay on the duty of civil disobedience. King talks about on page 14, reading on the duty of civil disobedience while still at Morehouse. He said, I became convinced that non-cooperation is on page 14 in our book. Non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good. No other person has been more eloquent and passionate in getting this idea across than Henry David Thoreau. As a result of his writings and personal witness, we are the heirs of a legacy of creative protest. The teaching of Thoreau came alive in our civil rights movement. Indeed, they're more alive than ever before, whether expressed in a sit-in at a lunch counter, a freedom ride into Mississippi, a peaceful protest in Albany, Georgia, a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. These are outgrowths of Thoreau's insistence that evil must be resisted and that no moral man can patiently adjust to injustice. Thoreau famously went to jail, and I think it was Emerson, he was one of the transcendentalists. Emerson comes to visit Thoreau in jail and it's like, hey, Hank, what you doing in the joint? And Thoreau famously said, why are you on the outside of the joint? When the world has become illegal, when the world is run by legal criminals, the place for the moral man, according to Thoreau and to Dr. King, is behind bars. And so going to jail, getting arrested in the movement becomes this huge honor, this huge rite of passage as part of the nonviolent civil resistance. Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is in prison. Henry David Thoreau. And if we're not for Thoreau, we wouldn't have this tradition. Now, today, this tradition is not stable. Protest tactics in the last wave of the last 2 years were escalated, and laws have been passed to criminalize Kingian nonviolent. The Justin Jones-led protest in Nashville to remove the bust of Klansman Naked Bedford Forrest from our state capitol building, the encampment they had there during the summer of 2020, is a perfect example. And they made it a felony for that encampment to exist, and that encampment no longer exists on the plaza, Legislative Plaza. But throughout the summer of 2020, there was an encampment in Nashville led by Justin Jones. In Mordecai Johnson, this story is so incredible. You have probably had a teacher say to you, go hear this speaker in Derryberry for extra credit at 7 o'clock on Tuesday. And you're like, oh, that sounds great, Dr. Smith, I'll go. That sounds great, Dr. Roberts, Dr. Dollar, I'll be there for the lecture on Tuesday at 6 o'clock for extra credit. And then Tuesday at 6 o'clock rolls around and you're like, I'm hungry. I need to go to the cafeteria. I need to call my friend. Oh, it's raining. I didn't bring an umbrella. I guess I'll skip the lecture. So in one Sunday afternoon, this is while he's at Crozer Seminary. So this would be late 40s, early 50s. So this would be after Morehouse, before Boston University. So one Sunday afternoon, I traveled. This is on page 23 in your textbook. One Sunday afternoon, I traveled to Philadelphia to hear a sermon by Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard University. He was there to preach for the Fellowship House of Philadelphia. Dr. Johnson had just returned from a trip to India, and to my great interest, he spoke of the life and teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. His message was so profound and electrifying that I left that meeting and bought a half a dozen books on Gandhi's life and works. I just keep thinking, what if Martin Luther King had come down with a cold, or decided to go to the movies, or shoot billiards, with some buddies instead of going to that talk? What if Dr. King had decided not to go to the talk by Mordecai Johnson one Sunday afternoon? I mean, that day is so pivotal in the history of planet Earth, because he decided to go hear a lecture for, I'm guessing it was for extra credit. I don't know if it was extra. So I'm just so glad that Dr. King went to hear Mordecai Johnson one Sunday afternoon. I drove to Philadelphia. Like most people, I had heard of Gandhi. I'm reading from King again, but I had never studied him seriously. As I read, I became deeply fascinated by his campaign of nonviolent resistance. I was particularly moved by his salt march to the sea and his numerous fasts. The whole concept of satyagraha, satya, which is truth, which equals love, and agraha, which is force, which means truth force or love force, was profoundly significant to me. As I delved deeper into the philosophy of Gandhi, my skepticism concerning the power of love gradually diminished, and I came to see for the first time its potency in the area of social reform. Prior to reading Gandhi, I had about concluded that the ethics of Jesus were effective in individual relations, and the turn the other cheek philosophy and love your enemies philosophy were only valid, I had previously felt, when individuals were in conflict with other individuals. When racial groups and nations were in conflict, a more realistic approach seemed necessary. But after I read Gandhi, I realized how utterly mistaken I was. So a Black Baptist from Atlanta needed a Indian Hindu saint named Gandhi to teach him about Jesus. That love is a force that can be deployed in the world assertively, a love force, a truth force, to fight evil. Gandhi was probably the first person in history to lift the love ethic of Jesus above mere interaction between individuals to a powerful and effective social force on a larger scale. Love for Gandhi was a potent instrument for social and collective transformation. It was in this Gandhian emphasis on love and nonviolence that I discovered the method for social reform that I had been seeking. The intellectual and moral satisfaction that I had failed to gain from the utilitarianism of Bentham and Mill and the revolutionary methods of Marx and Lenin, the social contracts theory of Hobbes, and the back to nature optimism of Rousseau, the Superman philosophy of Nietzsche, I found in the nonviolent resistance philosophy of Gandhi. And so he was able to put Gandhi and Thoreau in conversation with these other philosophical greats like Marx and Nietzsche. So for Dr. King to take Gandhi and Thoreau so seriously was a game changer. It was a world changing moment. This famous quote from Gandhi is in the film, the Gandhi movie. If you've never seen it, I can't recommend it enough. He says, "When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love has always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall. Think of it always." So, weeping may last for a night, but joy will come in the morning. So Gandhi and King have weaponized love and joy and faith and truth to change the whole world, not just to change themselves. King also, during this time, is reading some hard-hitting, famous white Protestant theologians. From Reinhold Niebuhr, he gets a theory of evil and a theory of sin and a theory of social evil and social sin and kind of a criticism of pacifism, of pure nonviolence, that is colored by the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany and World War II. And so in Niebuhr, he has this kind of social justice Christianity that is not purely pacifistic and kind of a criticism of the overly idealism of some liberal and peacenik type philosophers. And from Paul Tillich, he has this idea of the pervasiveness of God that saturates everything. Tillich called God the ground of all being. And these guys will be very influential on King as he's writing in graduate school. And so our textbook takes us kind of, through a journey with King on theology. And he discusses what he considers to be the too much optimism that some of the peace lovers will have. That some of them will take their pacifism too far. And he believes that Gandhian pacifism is realistic and tactical, and so he gets in dialogue with Reinhold Niebuhr around this question, around pages 25, 26, 27 of our textbook. When he gets to Boston University, he writes his dissertation, which he finally completes upon moving to Montgomery and pastoring his first church, called A Comparison of the Conception of God in the Thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Wyman. Submitted for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy at Boston University Graduate School. Have you all ever thought about what God is, and whether you believe in it or not? What is it? If you have a working definition of God that you're fully confident in, just type it in the chat as we go. But what King is wrestling with in this dissertation and in general during his years as a academic theologian at Crozer and at Boston is this one sense of God that's completely outside of us and completely outside of the world, a God of ultimate transcendence. And transcendence here means verticality, up there, out there, outside the world, outside of us, completely independent and autonomous of us, and transcendent, meaning all powerful. So there you get your God of omniscience and omnipotence and omnipresence, all powerful, all knowing, all present everywhere. And also out here. I think you might hear my Alexa in the background. If you can't, I apologize. Alexa's talking in the. If you can't hear her, that's a good thing. Tillich had this idea of the imminence of God. God is completely present in the world, and God's presence in the world is inflected and infected into each and every one of us and into nature, sometimes called pantheism, sometimes called panentheism, but it's God in a sunset, God in the trees, and God in each and every one of us, and a God that is more horizontal, a God that is pervasive at our own level that we can relate to. So the transcendence of God, the otherness of God, the God out here and up there, and the immanence of God, the God fully present, nearer to us than we are to ourselves. I, as a professionally trained theologian and as a person who has come up in the Christian tradition, I think the best path is some melding and molding of the two. And I think that's ultimately what King agrees to with his dissertation, is that God can be a very personal God, a God that you know like a sibling or a parent, and then God can also be a very a God in nature and a God in us and a God in the world. But most people tend in one direction or the other. And I think King was trying to come up with a synthesis here. Now, I did not put up the name of Hegel, but Hegel is a philosopher, and I am not a Hegelian. And so I'm going to be doing a poor job here. But Hegelian thinking and dialectical thinking that King was very famous for involves a thesis. I'm going to use the chat to do this, an antithesis and a synthesis. And King loved this way of thinking. And so he was a both and thinker as opposed to an either or thinker. So there was a group of theologians at Boston University when he was studying there that were called the Boston Personalists. And they talked about all these different aspects of God being a personal God. He came to believe that sin and redemption are collective projects. Many people who come up in a more traditional Orthodox Christianity or even a fundamentalist or evangelical Christianity have come to see sin as a project of individual fallenness and individual salvation. So my sin is my alcoholism. By the way, I am a recovered alcoholic. I'm sober 12 years, but I used to drink a lot. So my alcoholism would be an example of my sin. If you're in a relationship and a spouse is unfaithful to another spouse, that would be a sin. Maybe I ran too many traffic lights and I got a bunch of tickets. So, I cheated on the exam. I plagiarized a paper. Dr. King was accused after he died of plagiarizing that very dissertation that I just told you about, and scholars studied it, and they did find out that he lacked all the proper academic attributes for citations, and he did not fully cite his sources, and he did copy passages without putting quotations around them, and other forms of overt plagiarism. Intentional or unintentional, we'll never know. The university upheld his doctorate, and they never, revoked his doctorate after his death. But expert scholars agreed that King was guilty of plagiarism on that dissertation. Individual sin is maybe a personal estrangement or separation from God. You're just lost. You're alienated. You feel uncomfortable in your own skin. You don't like yourself. You suffer from depression or anxiety. So individualist theologies put all of these things on us as kind of we're broken, right? We're just kind of just not okay. And I suffer from anxiety and ADHD and other things. And like some days I'm just not okay. But I don't buy into this sort of like utter depravity idea, right? I don't think King did either. King saw sin as more of a collective problem, a problem of that was pervasive in society. And in his response that he got from Rauschenbusch, he has the novel, and it's not that novel anymore, but it's a very powerful idea at the time to talk about this, that redemption was collective as well. Sin is a social problem, and salvation is a social problem. We are saved as a society, not as individuals. And what's broken in our society today might be poverty and extreme wealth and inequity and climate crisis, and it might not be homosexuality. That isn't necessarily considered a sin in some churches anymore. Some churches never considered it a sin, but more churches are accepting and supportive of it than have ever been before in the United States. And so King was, I think, on this very strongly progressive arc away from sin being a personal problem to being all of our problems. And so these, and I can't stress this enough, because if you've been exposed, some of you may or may not have been exposed to some of these ideas here in the coming of age as you have in the 21st century. All of these ideas are very fluent in the 21st century, but you may or may not have been exposed to them. But if you've been exposed to them, you completely are tracking with me, and you understand what I'm saying, and you feel there is some resonance and some truth to this. But I want you to understand, in the 20th century, these ideas were everywhere. So King was a man of his age. He believed in modernity. King believed that science and philosophy and all the aspects of modernity were valid, and that religion needed to become relevant to modernity. And so he was very much against what he would call, so he was a fan of modernity, and he was very much against what he would call sentimentalism, superstition, or emotionalism within religion. There's this line in the book, if I can put my finger on it, where he said that he finally, looks like it's going to be during the Crozier years or in the, let me see if I can find this one line. It's such a powerful line. This is on page 15, so he's still at Morehouse. He's just a teenager. It was then that the shackles of fundamentalism were removed from my body. More and more, I could see a gap between what I learned in Sunday school and what I was learning in college. My studies made me skeptical, and I could not see how many facts of science could be squared with religion. I revolted, too, against the emotionalism of much Negro religion and the shouting and the stamping. I didn't understand it, and it embarrassed me. I often say that if we as a people had as much religion in our hearts and souls as we have in our legs and our feet, we could change the world. I had seen that most Negro ministers were unlettered, not trained in seminaries, and that gave me pause. I had been brought up in a church and knew about religion, but I wondered whether it could serve as a vehicle to modern thinking, whether religion could be intellectually respectable as well as emotionally satisfying. So King was just passionate that religion and the modern world should be synchronized with each other and not opposing each other. And so he wasn't not a fundamentalist. What and today when we talk about fundamentalism, we talk about all the political like hot button issues. That's not what it originally meant. In terms of Christian fundamentalism, what core beliefs about God and Jesus do you think would make you a religious fundamentalist in terms of, and this would be the way in which King, and again here, liberal for him was not a political term. It was a social and a theological. It didn't mean Democrat or Republican. It meant a social and theological perspective. What would be some basic things that would make religion fundamentalist religion? What would be some basic beliefs? You could type in the chat if you would. That's already coming into the more social interpretation of fundamentalism that we have today, patriarchy. But core beliefs about the Christian faith would be things like this: that the mother of Christ was a virgin, that Jesus was fully divine and fully human, that there was a literal bodily resurrection, that there's a literal heaven and hell. These are the kinds of beliefs that are kind of fundamental beliefs. A lot of the social stuff that comes after, but like there's a social, I think you raise a good point though, Elena, like we have a social gospel that King is talking about in the beloved community. Conservative theologians and Christians, they have a social gospel too, and it is patriarchal. They call it complementarianism, but it's gender essentialism. Men and women are essentially different. The male is the head of the household and things like this. But this is the latter day stuff that we've gotten in the last 30 or 40 years, really since the rise of the religious right, that really happens in the late 70s and the early 80s. There was a lot more of conservative Christians were liberal back in the day. They were the abortion topic never really becomes a topic until much later. And it was segregation. I think segregation and white supremacy was one of the main things that kept the Southern church going in the 50s and the 60s. And so, equality between the races was definitely or lack thereof was a social gospel contest during King's period. But King, as a young man, was questioning these topics of what it really meant. I think King saw Jesus as a young man more as a human than as God. He saw the possibility of the virgin birth being a myth rather than a literal fact, and that's the kind of stuff that made King a small, what I call a small L liberal during his upbringing. So I'm going to switch now. So I've taken us through academic theology and how it shaped and formed King. I've taken us through the core concepts of the beloved community and nonviolence. I'm going to talk about a formative community for Dr. King that we don't really have Dr. King without. And he was very critical in that passage I just read of his home training. But King is the child of the Black church, right? And Dr. King is a great African-American preaching orator. So even though he can be critical of other Black preachers from his vantage point within the Black church, he's a Black Baptist minister who is the son of a Black Baptist minister who was the son of a Black Baptist minister. He's third generation Black preacher from Georgia. So he is steeped in a tradition called the Black church. And as you know, during slavery times, the slave community was allowed. These are people who were enslaved. I don't even want to call them slaves, but people who were enslaved were allowed to worship amongst themselves, and they became literate. They taught themselves to read. They read the Bible, and they found in Bible the story of Moses against Pharaoh and the story of let my people go. And there you have, the emergence of the abolition movement. You have people like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, because King did not emerge out of nowhere. He comes in the lineage of, of Frederick Douglass and of Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And so they would have church on the plantation segregated from the master, and they would learn the story of the Exodus, of the liberation of God's people, and they made that their story. And so the Black church in America has been a story of liberation from captivity. It's been a kind of liberation theology. It's been a story of Black liberation. And though King is somewhat dismissive of the physicality of that experience, it is a truly amazing experience. If you've never experienced really fired up Black American worship experience, this is something I would encourage you to do. Put on your mask and find you go to a place like Nashville or Chattanooga or Knoxville or Memphis or Atlanta, and when it's not Omicron, because they'll probably be online. You go during a bad pandemic, and they'll probably the door will be locked, and they'll have the name of the website you're gonna have to watch on. But when the pandemic has subsided, go to a good Black church worship service if you've never been to one, or go find some video of some good Black preaching online, and you'll see what I'm talking about. I like Reverend Otis Moss III out of Chicago, out of the Trinity United Church of Christ. Reverend Howard John Wesley of Alpha Street Baptist Church near the Washington, D.C. area. These are a couple of my generation, Gen X Black preachers that are really incredible. Otis Moss III went to Morehouse, also spent some time in Cleveland, Ohio, where I was from for a while. So Dr. Cornel West, one of the preeminent African-American scholars in the world, outlines these characteristics of the Black church experience in the United States. He says that the African-American church is aware of the tragic, and this is aware of all the problems in life. The African-American church is aware of the prophetic, and remember, prophetic is not predicting the future, rather speaking truth to power and calling out, the leaders of Israel. In the Old Testament prophets, the canon of the Old Testament prophets would be, your Micah and your Jeremiah and your Amos and your Isaiahs and your Ezekiels. These texts are calling out power, speaking truth to power. So the Black church is tragic and prophetic. It's oral, and then it's this incredible orality. It's a music of the sermon. The sermon is a rap. It's hip hop before you have hip hop. The sermon is a rap. It's a revolutionary art form. And compared to some African American preachers, to be honest with you, King is brilliantly articulate and brilliant in his word choice, but he's not the most performative by any means in terms of this. You can see incredible performance characteristics in the Black pulpit. Physicality, somebodyness. Dr. Reverend Jesse Jackson, we'll learn about a little bit, as one of the fellow travelers in the movement. Jesse Jackson, I am somebody. We talk about this. I am somebody. In homefulness. The church is a home place. It's a place where you are in your community and you're in your element. The Black church practices historical patience, meaning it's a marathon and not a sprint. We practice revolutionary joy. That celebration on a Sunday morning is a part of our revolutionary obligation, because people who have been in social justice movements get easily burnt out. There's a lot of burnout. There's a lot of depression. There's a lot of infighting, truth be told, in activist movements. And so therefore, this dependence on the celebration of joy that you have in the Black church experience, this is a rejuvenating experience. As we'll see in our study of the Montgomery bus boycott next week, the mass meetings they would have at night at church were a way of energizing the people so they could walk to work the next day. Solidarity inside one's culture. These are people that had each other's backs, and they knew who they could trust and who they could count on. Engaged gaiety is right up there with revolutionary joy. It's this idea that you can smile even in the midst of tragedy. And there's so many examples in the Bible and Apostle Paul and other places that that the Christian message definitely tells and teaches to take persecution and tragedy and personal discomfort as an opportunity to praise. So I experience anxiety and ADHD. I've gotten in trouble with my employer. I've been in this controversy and that controversy, but I have a higher calling to a higher power, and I will celebrate, the new day. Every day is a new day. So this idea of the church as a place of joy and celebration is very important. And then it's just an art. It's an art, and it's musical. It's all get out. I mean, it's a throwdown. The gospel music and the good preaching. It is a true art form that you will experience in African American church. And King is fully a child of the Black church. King is also a beneficiary of the HBCUs. The HBCUs are the historical Black colleges and universities. My mentor, Professor Baldwin, said that Morehouse reminded King that the church did not have to compromise its spiritualizing proclivity in order to become a forum for new and creative ideas and a transforming force in the socio-political arena. So I already read to you a passage out of our textbook where Dr. King is saying that he wanted to be able to square his understandings of modernity and science with his religion. And so he did not want his religion to be in any way adversarial or in any way disconnected from modern ideas. And he learned that at Morehouse College. And he was influenced by this gentleman here, Benjamin Mays at Morehouse. There was a parallel person, a little bit older than Dr. King, who ended up being up there at Boston University by the name of Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman is a mystical Christian. He's a Christian who believes in all religions and that God is present in all things. And he had a book called Jesus and the Disinherited. And it is said that Dr. King always carried Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited, with him when he was traveling. So in his suitcase or in his preaching briefcase, he would always have a copy of the Bible and of Jesus and the Disinherited. And Dr. Thurman said, the things that are true in religion are in religion because they are true. They are not true because they are found in religion. And so this idea that the pursuit of truth itself is ultimate, it was very consistent with King's thinking, right? And so if you could take from science and you can take from religion and you can blend those two and find truth there, that is the capital T truth that he knows in the teachings, for example, of Jesus. This is a great Thurman quote that just is important for you guys who are setting out and beginning careers. Because this is the career advice of Howard Thurman. He said, do not ask what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive and then go do that. Because the world needs is people who have come alive. And so finding a career and a path about which you are passionate about is ultimate. And I've been teaching this class that we're in right now since 2014, and it's 2022. So that I've been allowed to teach this class on Dr. King was me going and finding something that I'm passionate about, which is the Reverend King, and learning enough about it to where I could teach a college level class on him has been just, life-changing for me. And I hope that each and every one of you find something life-changing with which to engage your careers. You guys had asked. I think I'm going to go ahead actually and pause the recording right there, and let me clear my screen here for a minute. So that'll be a good introduction to the class. I'm going to keep going. We're not done yet, but I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to take another drink of water or some other beverages, some getting flat soda here. And I'm going to go ahead and, if I can, figure out how to do this. I'll email this to you, but I'm going to go ahead and start telling you guys about your first paper. I say that, but now let's see. see. Okay, all right. Let me pull this other slide up here. I think I know what I'm doing now. All right. If you need to shake something, do that. Stretch. Shake it out. Okay. So let me pull that slide back up again, because this slide connects with your paper. Okay. Who knows who any of these people are? Anybody? Mason, do you have any guess on any of these? From your teachings from your dad, can you take a stab at any of them?
I think I see, I don't know if this is correct, but I think I see Jesse Jackson in one of the photos.
Yes, all right. That's the most popular one on there, and Mason wins the class for today. So over here in the middle, I believe it would be the right side. I think that'll be on your right side. It's on my right side. Staring right at the camera, that's a picture of Jesse Jackson from 1969, right after King's passing. And then I will go counterclockwise. So above Jesse Jackson is Reverend Andrew Young. To his going across the top in the middle now, that is Diane Nash, James Bevel, and down at the bottom center, Reverend Ralph Abernathy. So your first, let's do one more. Okay. What about these people? Anybody recognize these people? Top left, Nina Simone. Under Nina Simone, Harry Belafonte. And the white woman, Joan Baez, and Mahalia Jackson. These are all musical influences on Dr. King. Dr. King was very, very much influenced by the music, and the music really sustained the movement. So your paper number one, and it's not due until, I'll tell you when it's due. It's on the syllabus I already mailed you on yesterday. Paper number one is called King's Influences, Inspiration, Collaboration, and Context. This first paper is not due until Wednesday, February 9th. So I'm giving you a far out. Now I've got a written out assignment sheet here that I'm going to tweak and I'm going to mail to you, but I'm going to read to you guys off of it right now. So I'm going to give you a list of influences and inspirations, fellow travelers. And I need you all to just pick one of them. Or since we're such a small class, if you wanted to pick two, and go and try to read some articles about them and write out, save your links, so you can make a proper citation. And we're going to try to learn, because King is not an isolated Superman hero. He's very embedded in the movement. So what was this person's contribution to the American Civil Rights Movement? What was their connection or connections to Dr. King? How did rhetoric and theology of nonviolent social change factor into their lives? And why is this person appealing and valuable and important? Why would we want to learn more about this person? On my notes I have here, it does not appear to have a word length. I'll come up with a word length. This is the easy paper of the three. There's only three papers. This is the easy one. It's kind of like the warm-up paper, and it's more of just a traditional report. It's more of a traditional, like, kind of lower division even high school style paper where you just go basically and do out a report. So this will get us all kind of working together on the same page. And then the 2 later papers are going to be analysis of King speeches and sermons, and one from a rhetorical perspective and one from a theological perspective. And I'll have very detailed handouts for those papers as well. But that's going to be your first paper, is to go and pick one of these people to learn more about. And I'll have some other examples as well. But these were all people that were really kind of important in the movement and adjacent to Dr. King. So I'm on a good roll, and we're going to finish. We are going to get out of here. We're not going to go till 8:50. I've got a kind of another kind of section of the lecture. But before I go further, I wouldn't mind soliciting a little bit of feedback about all of the material that we've digested so far tonight. So if you guys have any questions or comments about what we've talked about so far, I would really be curious if you want me to unpack or elaborate any of the concepts or theories, or if you want me to take a slightly deeper dive to explain any of these concepts or theories that we've addressed so far tonight. I'd really like to do that at this time before we move on, or just to review any of the stuff in the first part of the lecture tonight. Yeah, go ahead, Mason.
I don't know if I was supposed to say this out loud or if I could type it, but I really want to say this out loud. But
Go for it.
This is just a random question. So in the near future of this class, I don't know if this particular person will be mentioned, but will we talk about the different perspectives on what the civil rights movement should have been, with Dr. King's nonviolent approach and the different perspective that Malcolm X took?
Yes, absolutely yes. And we have a specific day on the syllabus, and that day on the syllabus is called, and I'll tell you what day it's coming up. And sharpen your thinking on this class, because the day is February the 23rd, in the heart of Black History Month, right around the anniversary of Malcolm's assassination. And the day is called Malcolm and Martin, Black is Beautiful and Black Power. So we're going to look at Stokely Carmichael. We're going to look at the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. We will definitely look at Malcolm X that day, and that will be, unfortunately, a survey of that. And I have profound expertise in King, and I don't consider myself an expert in Black Power or Brother Malcolm, but I believe that it is unfair to have this conversation as a class without giving due diligence to that part of the movement. And I'm so glad that you brought it up tonight. And it's important for several different reasons. But one thing that's really, really important to understand is that where King was seen as too much, too fast, too soon, too radical by white folk and too dangerous, Black folk saw him as a bit of a stooge for the white man, and somewhat too nice, playing too nice. And they wanted a more focused, militant approach. And one of the things about last summer or 2 summers ago is we have several leaders of the movement for Black Lives, but it's totally decentralized. And so we don't have these clear, like, visionaries, because Bobby Seale and Huey Newton as Black Power, they were visionaries, as was Stokely Carmichael and SNCC. And so and Dr. King and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they're all, there's Ralph Abernathy and Andrew Young and Jesse Jackson, all the people I mentioned just a moment ago. These people are all visionaries and incredibly talented leaders. And I mean, can you say who the leader of the Black Lives Matter movement is? I don't think we can. I think it's a more diverse movement, more eclectic movement. So, yes, we have to study Black Power and Malcolm X in this class, and we will on that day. But this is a class in King, and so we're going to study them as kind of as a counterpoint, really, to King. But we don't see those people as opposites in this class, and I've got some great content to bring you guys on that. That's an excellent question. History has not shown us that Martin Luther King Jr. is conservative or tame or weak or any of those things. But clearly at the time, I think there were people that thought he was maybe trying. One thing that I think King really cared about what people thought about him. King wanted to be loved, and he was a very loving person, but he was insecure and he wanted to be loved. And I think King wanted his support in the white community, and he wanted his support in the peace movement. He became very involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. He wanted his support in the peace movement, and he wanted young Black men to respect and like him. And among Black youth, he was very his reputation was very sketchy. And he went to Chicago, and he got attacked by the Klan in Chicago. He went, the Midwest, Chicago is this multiracial city, and these white nationalists are throwing bricks at him, in Chicago. So I mean, it's yeah, it was not easy being Martin Luther King Jr. Those are great questions and comments. Anyone else want to? Terry, yeah, go ahead, Elena, please.
Are we going to talk about how Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideals kind of affected these past couple of summers? Are we going to bring that into?
So I wish what do you think, by the way? Yes, and yes, but what do you think? Do you feel that, I mean, while all that was going on, were you thinking about him?
I was. I've done some research to the Black Lives Matter movement, and let me look at her name really quick. But Patrisse Cullors is actually, she talks in an interview, she was the first person to ever use hashtag Black Lives Matter. And she kind of drew from that nonviolent, but hey, look at this perspective. So are we also going to talk about how Black women affected Martin Luther King Jr.? Because I feel like he had a lot of women surrounding him.
So Martin Luther King Jr. has a very problematic relationship with women, and we are going to talk about on April the 13th, King's sins. And I'll just, I'm going to say this, but I will set it aside. But King had sexual relationships with women that were not Coretta. And we'll talk about that on the 13th. But I've set aside an entire day for gender and civil rights, past misunderstandings and unfinished revolutions. And we will talk about the women of the civil rights movement that day. And we will also talk about queer activists in civil rights on that day. So right after the week that we talk about Black Power and Malcolm X, we'll talk about women and queer people in the movement. So, but King was. Well, let me just give you the because I just read about. I'm always reading about King during this course, but I have years of my study. But then I always start refreshing and resetting my buttons when I teach this class, and I haven't taught it in 3 years, and so I've kind of just been immersing myself in King stuff. And I'm reading a particular book that is the history of the King movement, and it's an epic book. It's like several thousand pages long. And when they started the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they didn't have any staff members, and all of the Black male leaders were big egos. I hope this is not a news flash for anybody, but that popular male leaders have like ego problems. But the SCLC was very successful, but it was a little bit disorganized. And King was going around and giving a lot of speeches and bringing in money. And there was leaders all over the South like Joseph Lowry and Fred Shuttlesworth. And this SCLC was founded in the late 50s, right after the Montgomery bus boycott, to have a national organization. And they really wanted a alternative national organization that was not the NAACP. And at the time, the NAACP was seen as a little bit too conservative and a little bit too northern and urban and oriented around legislation and legal things. And some people today would tell you that the NAACP is conservative. And so the staff member for the SCLC was Ella Baker, African-American civil rights activist who had a 5-decade career in the civil rights movement. Ella Baker is a perfect example of a behind-the-scenes female leader in the movement, who sometimes gets put into the background, and that's just not right. So you guys have asked me about 2 really important things about studying this movement, which is the presence of Black power and the presence of women. And on both counts, I've thought about that, and I hope you all will bring your A games that day too, because if I leave something out and you want to, or you learn, if you in your own reading learn something that you want to include, I hope you'll bring that to the table on those days. Thank you, both Mason and Elena. Those are fantastic questions and comments. Okay, so next week and the week after, we're going to have a lot of content on Montgomery, and I've got 2 films that we're going to be watching related to the Montgomery bus boycott. One of the worries I had if we do pivot to online was watching movies and how that. But I think I figured out how to watch a movie inside Google Meeting, so where we could do it. I don't know that the audio will be the toppest quality, but I think if we all mute our mics, I think I can pull that off. And we're going to practice with a YouTube video here in just a minute. And so that's one thing to be aware of. But I'm absolutely happy to be on campus and to meet you guys also. I just want to be safe as absolutely possible as well. So and we, tech is not allowed to require a mask, but like if I'm sitting there just watching a movie, with you guys and I'm not lecturing, I'll certainly put a mask on. Let's see here. So in this next section, we're going to watch a short clip of King speaking, and we'll be doing it through a YouTube video, and hopefully the audio will come through here. Okay, so I'm going to pivot to. I'm going to go ahead of the story in Montgomery. So we're going to get the full story of Montgomery next week, and we're going to watch the amazing film, HBO film Boycott. It's just an incredible. I just watched it again yesterday, and it's so good. One of my favorite movies. We watch. I don't know. So I like all the movies that we're going to watch in this class. And so Professor Baldwin, who's my mentor in King Studies, has written a couple of different books on the prayer life of Dr. King. He has one book that's just a collection of King's prayers that he gave. I'm going to pivot to why this is effective to the Montgomery bus boycott in just a second. So these are the different types of prayer that you experience in Christian life. And I think a lot of us think the only kind of prayer there is like a prayer of petition. We're basically asking God for stuff, or for healing or intercession to heal. But there's prayers of adoration where you just are celebrating. I have an author, a white woman author, from contemporary author by the name of Anne Lamott. Anne, A-N-N-E, Lamott, L-A-M-O-T-T. And she says all prayers can be summarized in 3 words. And I think all of these prayers could be put in each one of these categories. She says the 3 essential prayers are help, thanks, and wow. So adoration would be a wow prayer. And in church, we get really God, you are so awesome. And in all of your awesomeness, God, I beseech thee to dispel thy awesomeness upon this awesome gathering of students here on this call right now, dear Lord. Right. But it's a celebration of God's godness. It's just admiration and gratitude. Confession is when we have to unload our innermost secrets. Petition is when we're seeking an intervention. Thanksgiving, pure gratitude. Meditation and contemplation is simply sitting in the presence of the holy, and you don't have to do anything or say anything. You maybe do some deep breathing exercises. If you've ever done yoga, you make sure you know where your feet are on the floor, your butt is in your chair, you relax your shoulders, and you just sit quietly. Prayers can be involved in exploration, surrender, and discovery. Prayer is important in the movement for civil rights because it was practiced at all major events: vigils, marches, campaigns, rallies, and pilgrimages. And prayer is one of the number one weapons of the peaceful warrior of the nonviolent civil rights movement. Prayer is weaponized in the pursuit of peace and justice by the civil rights movement. Okay. Dr. King is getting death threats. They're bombing Dr. King's house. They're bombing the houses of other leaders in the Montgomery bus boycott. Dr. King is getting these phone calls of people harassing him at the house. Prank calls. One night he gets up to pick up the phone, gets out of bed, and he gets one of these prank calls. And he can't go back to sleep. So he makes a cup of coffee. He's definitely not going back to sleep now. He's making a pot of coffee in the middle of the night. So he's pulling an all-nighter. He was young. He was 27 at the time. And you go to the National Park site at Atlanta, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. National Monument in Atlanta, Georgia. And they have a room in the museum there that's set up like a kitchen. And it's got a little coffee cup. And he sat down that night and he prayed what is known as the kitchen table prayer. The kitchen table prayer was that moment when Dr. King discovered religion for himself, when God was outside of the theology books that I so did my best to teach you about tonight, with his Paul Tillich and his Reinhold Niebuhr and his studies of these great saints, of the Christian tradition. And here he is, young man, 27 years old-ish, right? 26 years old, brand new baby, first kid, new dad, new wife, new church, new movement, and they want to kill me. And his entire life, they wanted to kill him. There was people trying to kill him his entire life. And he sits down that night and he prays a prayer over a cup of coffee. And that's what we're going to hear from now. Let's see if and we'll see how the audio goes. I'm going to mute myself.
And we started our struggle together. Things were going well for the first few days, but then about 10 or 15 days later, after the white people in Montgomery knew that we meant business, they started doing some nasty things. They started making nasty telephone calls and came to the point that some days more than 40 telephone calls would come in, threatening my life, the life of my family, the life of my children. I took it for a while in a strong manner, but I never will forget one night very late. It was around midnight, and you can have some strange experiences at midnight. I had been out meeting with the steering committee all that night, and I came home. My wife was in the bed, and I immediately crawled into bed to get some rest, to get up early the next morning to try to keep things going. And immediately, the telephone started ringing, and I picked it up. On the other end was an ugly voice. That voice said to me in substance, "Nigger, we are tired of you and your mess now. And if you aren't out of this town in 3 days, we're going to blow your brains out and blow up your house." I'd heard these things before, but for some reason that night it got to me. I turned over and I tried to go to sleep, but I couldn't sleep. I was frustrated, bewildered. And then I got up and went back to the kitchen, and I started warming some coffee, thinking that coffee would give me a little relief. And then I started thinking about many things. I pulled back on the theology and philosophy that I had just studied in the universities, trying to give philosophical and theological reasons for the existence and the reality of sin and evil. But the answer didn't quite come there. I sat there and thought about a beautiful little daughter who had just been born about a month earlier. We have 4 children now, but we only had one then. She was the darling of my life. I'd come in night after night and see that little gentle smile. And I sat at that table thinking about that little girl and thinking about the fact that she could be taken away from me any minute. And I started thinking about a dedicated, devoted, and loyal wife who was over there asleep. She could be taken from me, I could be taken from her. And I got to the point that I couldn't take it any longer. I was weak. And something said to me, "You can't call on Daddy now. He's up in Atlanta 175 miles away. You can't even call on Mama now. You got to call on that something and that person that your daddy used to tell you about. That power that can make a way out of no way." I discovered then that religion had to become real to me, and I had to know God for myself. And I bowed down over that cup of coffee. I never will forget it. Oh, yes, I prayed a prayer, and I prayed out loud that night. I said, "Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I think the cause that we represent is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now, I'm faltering, I'm losing my courage." It seemed at that moment that I could hear an inner voice saying to me, "Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. Stand up for truth. And lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world. And I tell you, I've seen the lightning flash. I've heard the thunder roll. I've felt sin breakers dashing, trying to conquer my soul, but I heard the voice of Jesus saying, still to fight on. He promised never to leave me, never to leave me alone. No, never alone. No, never alone. He promised never to leave me, never to leave me alone. Sometimes I feel discouraged. And I don't mind telling you this morning that sometimes I feel discouraged. I felt discouraged in Chicago. As I moved through Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama, I feel discouraged. Living every day under the threat of death, I feel discouraged sometimes. Living every day under extensive criticism, even from Negroes, I feel discouraged sometimes. Yes, sometimes I feel discouraged and feel my works in vain. But then the Holy Spirit revives my soul again. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. God bless you.